In the frozen mountains of North Korea, the U.S. Marines were surrounded. Outnumbered nearly 8-1, cut off from supply and freezing to death. The world called it a defeat. The Marines called it something else entirely. After World War II, America believed it understood war. It had defeated Nazi Germany, crushed Imperial Japan, and emerged as the most powerful military force on Earth. So when the Korean War erupted in 1950, many leaders believed it would be quick, limited, and controllable. That belief would soon collide with reality in one of the most brutal environments any American force had ever faced. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir was not just a clash of armies, it was a collision between assumptions and truth. And the reason it still echoes through U.S. military history is because it forces an uncomfortable question. How can something be called a defeat and still be a victory? The road to Chosin began with confidence. After North Korean forces invaded the south, U.S. and United Nations troops were initially pushed back hard. But the daring amphibious landing at Incheon turned the war upside down. American forces surged north, liberating territory and chasing the enemy toward the Chinese border. The momentum felt unstoppable. Commanders believed the war might be over by Christmas. Soldiers were told they'd be home soon. That belief shaped everything that followed, and it was the first mistake. As U.S. forces pushed deeper into North Korea, warnings began to surface. Intelligence reports hinted that Chinese forces were moving. Chinese leaders had publicly declared they would intervene if foreign troops approached their border. But those warnings were dismissed or downplayed. Why? Because American leaders believed China lacked the ability or the will to fight the United States directly. They underestimated both China's resolve and its capacity for mass warfare. History has punished that kind of arrogance every time it appears. The Chosin Reservoir sat high in the mountains, surrounded by narrow roads, steep ridges, and unforgiving terrain. Winter came early there. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. At that cold, weapons malfunctioned. Vehicles froze. Wounds wouldn't bleed, they froze solid. Frostbite became as deadly as bullets. This was not terrain for maneuver warfare. It was terrain that punished existence itself. And yet, thousands of American Marines and soldiers were sent there with the assumption that resistance would be light. Then the Chinese struck. They did not attack with tanks or air power. They attacked with silence, numbers, and patience. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers moved through the mountains at night, camouflaged by darkness and snow. They surrounded U.S. units without being detected. When they attacked, it was sudden, overwhelming, and relentless. Bugles echoed through the frozen valleys, not for theatrics but to coordinate mass assaults. To the Marines, it felt like the mountains themselves were coming alive. Within days, approximately 15,000 U.S. Marines and attached units found themselves encircled by nearly 120,000 Chinese troops. Supply lines were cut. Air support was limited by weather. Roads were ambushed constantly. Every mile of movement cost lives. From a strategic perspective, this was a nightmare scenario. According to conventional military logic, this force should have been destroyed. This is where the why becomes important. Why didn't the Marines collapse? Why didn't they surrender? Why didn't the Chinese annihilate them? The answer lies not in tactics alone, but in identity. The U.S. Marines at Chosin were not fighting to win territory. They were fighting to survive together. Leadership mattered deeply. Commanders like Chesty Puller did not sugarcoat the situation. When told his forces were surrounded, Puller famously said that it simplified the problem. That wasn't bravado for morale alone. It reframed reality. Retreat was no longer an option. Only movement forward in any direction could save them. The Marines adapted. They formed defensive perimeters at night and attacked during the day. They coordinated artillery with near-perfect precision, often calling fire dangerously close to their own positions. They used airdrops to resupply ammunition, food and medical supplies, sometimes receiving frozen plasma that had to be thawed against soldiers' bodies. Wounded men refused evacuation, knowing every rifle mattered. Units that should have been destroyed instead became moving fortresses. The Chinese, despite their numbers, faced their own problems. They were lightly equipped. Many lacked winter clothing. Their logistics were stretched thin. They believed mass alone would break the Americans, but they underestimated Marine discipline, firepower, and cohesion. Every Chinese assault cost enormous casualties. Victory in war is not just about killing the enemy. It's about sustaining your own force. The Chinese paid a price they could not afford quickly. Eventually, the Marines did something extraordinary. They did not break out in panic. They fought their way out deliberately, step by step, carrying their wounded, their dead, and their equipment. This movement later became known as the fighting withdrawal, though Marines reject the word retreat. Over 17 days, they moved nearly 70 miles to the coast, under constant attack, through terrain that killed even when the enemy wasn't firing. By the time they reached evacuation ports, the Marines had lost thousands to combat and cold. From a purely territorial perspective, the United States had failed. North Korea remained contested. The advance to the Chinese border was reversed. On a map, it looked like defeat. But wars are not decided only by maps. The Chinese had intended to destroy the U.S. Marine Corps in Korea. They failed. Instead, they suffered catastrophic losses. The Marines preserved their combat power, their structure, and their identity. They proved they could survive encirclement, extreme weather, and numerical inferiority without collapsing. That lesson reshaped U.S. military doctrine forever. Why do Marines still call Chosin a victory? Because the enemy's objective failed. Because the Marines came out together. Because survival under impossible conditions became a form of dominance. Because Chosin taught the U.S. military humility. It forced leaders to respect intelligence warnings, terrain, logistics, and climate. It reminded America that technological superiority does not cancel human limits. It also reinforced something deeper, that cohesion, leadership, and trust matter more than numbers. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir stands today not as a tale of triumph, but as a warning wrapped in resilience. It reminds us that victory is not always about advancing forward. Sometimes it is about refusing to be erased. That is why the United States lost Chosin on paper, and why the Marines who survived it call it one of their greatest victories.